Why are fashion and gaming collabs always whack? You know exactly what I'm talking about. The $100 basic tee with a PNG just slapped on the front. It's always the same lazy collaborations from these companies, and quite frankly, it's insulting. Gamers are some of the most discerning customers out there, and video games serve as some of the most artistically rich and inspiring material. So why do these luxury and streetwear brands treat collaboration like a simple exercise of putting two logos together and putting a pre-approved picture onto an overpriced t-shirt? And think about it, right? If the skins in these games are the clothing of our characters, why do we settle for whack merch? The skins of our favorite video games allow us to express ourselves digitally, so clothing companies, it's time to take note. My name is Mike Sunday, a graphic designer and a content creator. I bring light to the influences and invisible design of the aesthetics of our favorite games, anime, and fashion. And I'm stoked to be working on this new series, Points, with 100 Thieves, shedding a light on all things culture through the lens of gaming. Now, the current market is hitting its breaking point, caused by two things: corporate oversaturation and, of course, consumer fatigue. Now, as this consumer spend starts to slow down, brands are trapped in the constant cycle of marking down to try and clear inventory, raising retail prices to try and recoup margin, and cutting corners on manufacturing. And on the licensing side, the ecosystem is totally choked. Too many brands turning out too many drops, all fighting over the exact same licensing IP. Designers are forced to be in this cycle of trying to churn out new ideas every single season, yet are restricted to the same finite, hyper-guarded assets that legal teams just dole out. What we get is a totally exhausted marketplace where consumers are paying more for less. Now, fashion corporations look at gaming and see 3 billion active users and see it as this gold mine for Gen Z and millennial attention. But like anything in a capitalist society, it is an extraction point, not a way to integrate into the culture. To these megacorps, this is a low-risk, high-margin play. They don't invest in custom garment construction, bespoke silhouettes, or deep narrative storytelling. Why? Because it cuts into their profits and requires real creative risk. Instead, it's the standard cash grab playbook. Thousands of blank heavyweight tees, a co-branded PNG marketed as limited edition, leveraging that scarcity mindset that no one really even buys into anymore, betting on loyalty of fans. It's transactional clout chasing, right? The brand gets to claim they're culturally relevant without ever having to understand the people who play the games. So if that was the fashion companies, the gaming companies aren't innocent either. When a game publisher collaborates with a fashion brand, the licensing team's primary goal is to protect their IP, not make cool streetwear. They need to preserve brand equity and prevent trademark dilution. So the game studio IP, their logos, their characters, assets, key art, this is sacred real estate for them. So to protect these assets, they hand off what's known as a brand style guide. And instead of letting the designer interpret characters or the world in a way fashion enthusiasts would understand, they lock it down. So there's a fundamental breakdown of the design process. 1, designers become asset placers. Instead of actually designing a garment from scratch, or at least how the graphics can be altered, placed in interesting ways, have novel finishings, applique. The designer's job is reduced to opening an Illustrator file, dragging the approved graphics onto a blank mockup and passing it off to the legal team for sign-off. And then 2, you have this approval bureaucracy. Every single draft goes through rounds of corporate feedback, corporate legal, publisher marketing, licensed brand managers, creatively risky ideas like avant-garde cuts or subtle tags that allude to the world in the games will get flagged as violating usage guidelines. What survives in this corporate review chain is the path of least resistance, a safe center chest place logo on a generic tee that anyone could buy. And 3, these collabs always end up falling into a safe default. When you have these two multi-million-dollar corporations and they decide to do a collaboration, their legal teams are incentivized to minimize risk. And what ends up happening is there's usually a war of attrition between the legal team and the creative team. And legal teams get really good at nitpicking and grinding creatives down, which inevitably puts the timelines at risk. Creative ideas always start adventurous, but then get whittled down round after round, revision after revision, until there is no more fight left in the creative team. Production needs to start, so the team defaults to the laziest, safest execution. All right, so what is the cure? Here are some of the best in-class examples that have worked with gaming companies in creative ways. First of all, we have Pokemon and Vandy the Pink. Pokemon Vandy the Pink collab was an absolute masterclass in taking a heavily guarded, hyper-corporate IP and using clever design restraint not only to satisfy the Pokemon licensors, but to also satisfy streetwear heads. Instead of falling into the trap of printing loud, childish characters on a hoodie, Vandy worked within the legal framework, but also leveraged iconic Pokemon silhouettes, flourished with tonal textures. Also, by abstracting the Pokemon into clean structural shapes and subtle cutouts, like on the varsity jackets, the pieces avoided looking like playground merch while still being instantly recognizable for real fans. I love the ear paneling on the hoodies, the bespoke color blocking on the jeans. They directly nodded to the fan favorites without sacrificing real streetwear silhouettes. It proves that when a licensor gives a designer room to re-engineer the garment's actual form as opposed to just approving logo placement, you can turn a nostalgic childhood staple like Pokemon into a legitimate high-end streetwear staple. Okay, next we have Braindead and Magic the Gathering. I think this collaboration was successful because it bypassed the obvious surface level motifs like giant mana symbols or something like that. And instead, they dug into Magic the Gathering's basement dwelling 90s archives. Braindead didn't just approach the IP as one of the biggest trading card games of all time, but at its genesis, where it was an underground subculture with rich, weird visual history. They unearthed vintage fantasy illustrations and ran them through their signature DIY style. And by remixing these retro assets with tie-dyeing and distressed washes, and the signature chaotic Braindead graphic approach, Braindead managed to avoid a lot of the tropes one might have when doing a collaboration of this size. Instead, they created an authentic expression of 90s nerd culture. It was a drop that felt like a vintage grail you might dig out of the basement of a comic book store, instead of a sterile corporate collaboration. Alright, now this one has to be one of my favorites, and it's a three-way collaboration. Yohji Yamamoto, Tekken, and Supreme. The way they've managed to integrate all three companies' DNA into this collection is honestly pretty miraculous. And overall, the collection just oozes aura. You get the vibey leather pants like you might see on Jin Kazuma. I love the old school approach, taking the portraits from the character select and making it into an all-over print. That button-up shirt is kind of a grail. Or even taking some of the old school character models and weaving it directly into the knitwear. That's something that Yohji does quite a bit, but having it with the Tekken spin is just chef's kiss. And so yes, while some of this collection just has a basic graphic application, the graphics themselves are super well done, subverting the loud logos and creating almost a flip, integrating Tekken, Supreme, and Yohji Yamamoto. This has got to be my personal favorite on the list. Now, before we get to the final, I wanted to have some honorable mentions, ones that aren't necessarily explicit gaming collabs, but deserve to be in the conversation and are well within the orbit of video game inspired collabs. All right, first up, we have the Loewe Pixel collection, and that was an interesting exercise in translating this digital game aesthetic into a high luxury craft without having to resort to graphics. Jonathan Anderson sort of co-opted this 8 or 16-bit style and low poly voxels and engineered them into the actual physical garment construction. Now, in my opinion, this aesthetic is impossible to take out of the world of Minecraft, and it's not an official collaboration, but it certainly felt like one. All right, next up on the honorable mention list, controversial as ever, Balenciaga and Fortnite. Demna integrated Balenciaga's DNA directly into Fortnite, proving that these in-game skins can be like digital runways. So not only were they in the game, but the physical collection also mirrored exactly what was happening in Fortnite's universe, creating this seamless loop between a virtual identity and a digital one. Now, I can't fully co-sign this because of the price points, and I just don't think the clothing is that cool, but you have to admit it was a dope co-marketing moment, really thinking about this transmedia approach. All right, next up is Subtitle and Jujutsu Kaisen. Not a gaming collab, but I think there's a lot of overlap between the anime community and the gaming community. Subtitle's collaboration with Jujutsu Kaisen should be the blueprint for how anime and fantasy should be integrated into clothing construction. Their first collection was built on the core philosophy that not only the uniforms, but the lore of the characters should be what dictates the language of the entire collection. Now, speaking of anime, this might be the ultimate anime and fashion collab. You probably already guessed it, Jun Takahashi's Undercover and Neon Genesis Evangelion. Jun Takahashi took the iconic silhouettes of the Eva mechs and transformed them into Undercover's avant-garde tailoring. Yes, there were some graphic approaches, especially in the knits, but the outerwear had been completely re-engineered to mimic the shapes and silhouettes of the mechs themselves. There were even glowing red LEDs to mimic the glowing red eyes of Unit 1, and I'll forever remember this collection because Undercover treated the source material as a rich visual source for their Fall/Winter 2021 collection. All right, back to video game collaborations. To me, the ultimate integration stands between technical apparel brand ACRONYM and Kojima's Death Stranding. This is what happens when you get a group of individuals who really care. Hideo Kojima, Yohji Shinkawa, and Errolson Hugh. This is the undisputed gold standard. It is the ultimate conversion of gaming and high fashion because it wasn't some corporate deal that suits cooked up 6 months before the game was about to launch. ACRONYM has been baked into the world of Death Stranding since day one. Yohji Shinkawa and Errolson Hugh engineered Sam Porter Bridges' gear in parallel. It got developed in the game as well in the real world. So when you look at Sam's uniform while he traverses the world of Death Stranding, all the modular pouches, pockets, weatherproof layering, they all follow ACRONYM's real-world logic. Even the core mechanics of the game, carrying cargo, surviving timefall rain, and the ability to quickly access your equipment, all feel like they make complete sense for ACRONYM's feature set. And if you've played the game, you already know that Errolson is Alex Weatherstone in the Death Stranding universe. So for Death Stranding 1, you have the J1A GTKP, where they've re-engineered and modified their flagship jacket to mirror Sam Bridges' Navy uniform, and having that yellow pocket on the front is a nod to the baby pod. And then for Death Stranding 2, they had the J91U WSDB in 2 different colorways, and even did the J91U WSKP for the Kojima Productions 10th anniversary. And the campaign for those jackets even featured Kojima, Shinkawa, and Hugh as mythical gods. It's got to be one of the coldest campaigns ever done for a jacket. True world building. So what's the final verdict? For now, there is no end in sight. As long as gamers keep shelling out hundreds of dollars for this mid-merch, corporate licensors and out-of-touch fashion houses will keep churning out lazy graphics on blank tees. But the glimmers of hope are there for the discerning customer. Whether it's ACRONYM engineering hand-in-hand with Kojima, Loewe starting to treat pixels almost like a fine leather craft, or brands like Braindead, 100 Thieves, and Subtitle, proving that cut-and-sew lore beats a lazy slapped-on graphic every single time. The blueprint for great gaming and fashion collabs already exists, and the taste level of the audience is finally catching up to the medium. Now it's on the rest of the industry to stop treating gamers like an easy payday and start treating garment design like the actual art form it is. So let me know, what are the laziest gaming collaborations? What are the best? Do you agree with my choices? Let's have a discussion down in the comments.